A white, middle-aged police officer stood rigidly in front of the courthouse's private parking lot, the badge on his chest gleaming under the morning sun, his face already twisted in suspicion. He narrowed his eyes at the black woman behind the wheel of a black sedan pulling into the space marked, "Reserved for Federal Judge." Before she could even open the door, his hand was already hovering over his holster, his voice sharp and demanding, slicing through the air with a venom coated in years of unchecked authority. "Ma'am, I need to see your ID. You can't park here. This area is restricted. Step out of the vehicle, now." Her brows slightly raised, not in surprise, but in that slow, tired disbelief that comes when the same battle has to be fought over and over again. She didn't say anything at first. She simply reached over to gather her leather briefcase, stepped out in quiet dignity, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. But the officer stepped directly in front of her, blocking her path like a wall that had stopped too many people like her from walking forward. "I said," he repeated, louder this time, glancing at the tinted windows of her car, "step away from the vehicle and present your identification. Unless you want to be arrested for trespassing." She looked at him fully now, her gaze steady, calm, but simmering with something unspoken. "I'm not trespassing," she said, voice low but firm. "This is my space. I park here every day." But he cut her off with a scoff, his tone laced with mockery. "Sure you do. And I'm the President of the United States," he muttered. "Now unless you're cleaning someone's office, I suggest you step back and wait where visitors belong. This entrance is for federal officials only." And that's when it happened. The moment that would set everything in motion. Her silence. Her refusal to plead. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, watching him, letting the weight of his assumptions collapse in on themselves. Until another officer, one who recognized her, came rushing out of the building, eyes wide with panic, yelling, "Sir! That's the judge. That's the federal judge assigned to today's hearings." The silence that followed was deafening. But it was too late. The damage was done. The words, the tone, the disrespect, all of it had already unfolded in front of cameras, courthouse staff, and visitors who stood frozen near the security checkpoint. Phones were recording. Whispers began to swell like waves. Something in the air shifted, heavy with discomfort and recognition. Because this wasn't just about a mistaken identity. This wasn't just a slip-up. It was a mirror. A reflection of what so many face every single day when who they are is erased by what they look like. And for a moment, the officer tried to recover. "This is all just protocol, ma'am. Standard procedure, but the look she gave him cut through every excuse he had rehearsed. And she didn't have to say a word for the crowd to feel the fire behind her silence. What the officer didn't know was that this woman, calm, poised, disrespected, was not only the federal judge presiding over one of the most high-profile racial discrimination cases in the state, but she was also someone who had dedicated her life to fighting the exact kind of prejudice that had just unfolded before a live audience. A woman whose roots carried stories of ancestors who had been denied every door she now held keys to. And today, those keys would turn more than just locks. What began as a typical day in the court quickly unraveled into a storm of reckoning. News outlets swarmed the courthouse by noon. Hashtags spread across social media like wildfire. Protesters gathered outside demanding accountability. But inside, something deeper was happening. A reckoning was building, not just for the officer, but for a system that had allowed this moment to exist in the first place. And yet, amidst the headlines, there was something else. Something the public didn't know. A decision she had already made. A plan set into motion long before this day. Because while the world was focused on what the officer had done, she was focused on what she was about to do. Justice wasn't going to come from anger. It was going to come from power. From position. From wisdom sharpened by years of being underestimated. And the real twist, the one that would leave every mouth in that courtroom hanging open, was still to come. You see, this wasn't just a personal insult. It was a public revelation. A moment that laid bare everything she had endured to get where she was, and everything that still stood in her way. This wasn't just about a parking lot or a badge or a mistaken identity. This was about history. This was about truth. And this was about to become one of the most unforgettable court cases in the state's history. But here's the question, when the very person you tried to humiliate becomes the one holding your future in her hands. What does justice really look like? Stick around. You're not going to believe what happens next. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this video. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. Your voice matters. Your dignity matters. And your story deserves to be heard, respected, and celebrated. We believe in powerful storytelling that reveals truth, inspires justice, and uplifts those who have been silenced for far too long. Now, sit back and get ready for a story that will stir your heart and open your eyes. And hey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next twist. Let's begin. The courthouse in Baltimore, Maryland, stood like a monument carved into the tension of a city still wrestling with its history. Tall, with stone columns and weathered steps, it was both a symbol of justice and a reminder of how far justice still had to go. On most mornings, the building opened to the usual rhythm, clerks arriving with coffee-stained folders, lawyers muttering last-minute thoughts into their phones, officers checking bags at security. But on this particular morning, something different lingered in the air. A wait. A pause between seconds. And at the heart of it all was a woman named Janelle Whitaker. Judge Janelle Whitaker was not the kind of person who demanded attention when she walked into a room, but she always had it. Not because of power or presence in the traditional sense, but because of her stillness, her quiet strength that carried years of struggle, resilience, and relentless effort. Her face, always poised, had learned long ago how to stay unreadable, even under pressure. Her skin was a rich, deep tone, her natural curls tied back into a low bun, and her eyes, sharp and steady, were the kind that made people second-guess what they thought they knew. Janelle had grown up on the west side of Baltimore, raised by a mother who cleaned offices at night and a father who drove buses for over 30 years. Her parents had no degrees, but they had a library full of second-hand books and a rule that every night, the television stayed off until homework was finished and discussed. From a young age, Janelle had seen how people looked at her family, how they talked down to her mother in stores, how her father was ignored even in his own neighborhood uniform. Those silent lessons shaped her ambition not just to rise, but to understand, to see the system from within and eventually hold it accountable. She wasn't driven by revenge or pride. Her motivation came from the thousands of people she'd seen fall through the cracks. Teenagers prosecuted like hardened criminals. Mothers begging for custody. Fathers imprisoned for offenses they couldn't afford to defend. She had promised herself long ago that if she ever wore the robe, she would never forget where she came from, and she hadn't. But remembering your roots didn't always protect you from the thorns still trying to pull you down. Janelle had earned her place with excellence, not exception. She graduated top of her class at Howard, clerked for a federal judge, earned a fellowship in civil rights law, and returned to Baltimore not to escape, but to serve. Her rise was undeniable, but her path wasn't smooth. Behind closed doors, she'd heard whispers, endured dismissive glances, been mistaken for a defendant, a secretary, a janitor. But she had built armor, not from coldness, but from clarity. She knew what she represented. She knew why she was there. And yet, on this particular morning, none of that mattered to Officer David Kearns. Kearns was a veteran cop, white, in his early 50s, with a chest that puffed up whenever he stood near a badge. He wasn't loud or outwardly aggressive, but he carried the confidence of a man who had never been forced to examine his own power. He'd worked courthouse security for years, had seen hundreds of people walk through those doors, and had made his judgments about them before they even spoke. His world was neat, categorized, and in it, people like Janelle Whittaker didn't belong in power, they were exceptions to be questioned, not respected. David Kearns wasn't the kind of man who shouted racial slurs or posted vile things online. He was something more complicated, and in some ways, more dangerous. His bias lived in micro-expressions, in the way he questioned certain people more than others, in the assumptions he made without realizing he was making them. To him, he wasn't a racist. He was just doing his job. But his job, like many others, was colored by the lens through which he viewed the world, a lens that had never been challenged, never been shattered. That morning, Kearns had been assigned to the private lot behind the courthouse, the one reserved for judges and senior officials. It was a job he liked, it gave him control over who came and went, a small domain of order in a city he often believed was losing it. When Janelle's sedan pulled into the lot, he didn't recognize the vehicle. He didn't recognize her. And something in her quiet confidence triggered his suspicion more than if she'd been loud or confrontational. She wasn't supposed to be there, not someone who looked like her. In his mind, she was either in the wrong place or pretending to be someone she wasn't. Either way, he had to intervene. There were rules. Protocol. Standards. And so, he did what he had always done. He blocked her path. He questioned her presence. He demanded her identification, not with curiosity, but with assumption. He didn't ask if she was who she said she was, he told her she wasn't. Janelle, meanwhile, had just ended a call with her law clerk when she pulled in. She had planned to review the case files over coffee in her chambers, prepare for a hearing involving housing discrimination, ironically. She didn't expect confrontation. She wasn't wearing her robe yet, wasn't carrying a badge, just her briefcase, her heels, and the same face that had caused a lifetime of misidentification. The exchange that followed wasn't explosive. It was restrained. But within that restraint lived something much deeper, humiliation, frustration, and the agonizing familiarity of being questioned, again, in a place she had earned with everything she had. And still, she didn't raise her voice. She had long ago learned that raising her voice only confirmed the narratives others were waiting to assign her. So instead, she stayed calm, even as her dignity was being chipped away with every sentence. Kearns wasn't aware that her chambers were just 2 floors above the checkpoint. He didn't know that her name was on the docket, that her signature had approved half the warrants he'd enforced in the last 6 months. To him, she was just another woman in the wrong place, another box to check, another perceived threat to neutralize. By the time Officer Ramirez came running from the side entrance, mouth open, hand gesturing frantically, it was too late. The damage wasn't in what had been said. It was in what had been assumed. And everyone watching knew it. Clerks fell silent. A janitor dropped his mop bucket in the hallway. 2 attorneys exchanged stunned glances. A young black intern froze near the elevator, her hands clutching a file she suddenly couldn't remember how to hold. The air thickened with unspoken truths, with decades of lived experience, with the knowledge that this moment wasn't rare, it was just seen. And through it all, Janelle stood still. Because she knew something Kearns didn't. She knew this wasn't the end of the story. And what neither he, nor anyone else, realized was that this day, this moment, would not disappear into an apology. It would ripple. It would spread. It would collide with truths that had been buried beneath silence for too long. And it would end, not with shouting or revenge, but with something far more powerful. Justice, in the hands of the woman he tried to deny. Because what Kearns didn't see was that behind her stillness was preparation. And behind her silence was thunder. Janelle walked through the courthouse halls like she always did, with quiet composure and practiced ease, but that morning, every glance that trailed her felt different. People didn't just see her anymore, they watched her. Some with guilt, others with awe, and a few with discomfort that burned behind forced smiles. She didn't change her pace. She didn't flinch. But inside her chest, something had shifted. It wasn't rage. It was a deeper ache, the kind that grows from knowing your presence alone still feels like a challenge in spaces you've earned your right to lead. And this time, there were witnesses, dozens of them, people who had seen, heard, and silently absorbed every word Officer Kearns had thrown at her. No robe, no title, no status had shielded her from what he assumed she was. The door to her chambers clicked shut behind her, and for a brief second, the stillness in the room felt like shelter. Her assistant, Marcia, a brilliant young woman with braids pulled into a bun and a heart full of fire, stared at her with wide, searching eyes. She had seen it happen, or at least enough of it to understand the weight of what had just taken place. "Judge Whittaker, are you okay?" Marcia asked carefully, not because she didn't already know the answer, but because some questions are invitations more than inquiries. Janelle didn't answer right away. She removed her coat, adjusted the sleeves of her blouse, and sat down behind her desk, her fingers lightly drumming against the wooden edge. "I'm fine," she finally said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed the steadiness in her posture. "We have work to do." But work didn't move forward as easily that morning. Her mind, usually so precise, kept wandering back to the parking lot. The way Kearns had looked at her. The audacity. The entitlement. And more than that, the comfort with which he had assumed dominance. There had been no doubt in his voice, no hesitation. He truly believed she did not belong. And that belief, so deeply embedded, wasn't just his. It lived in systems, institutions, expectations. He had simply made it visible. Later that morning, in courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was unusually heavy. Attorneys whispered behind folders, law clerks avoided eye contact, and the defendant sitting in the far left chair, a landlord accused of racial discrimination, fidgeted more than usual. Janelle presided with her usual clarity, but her gaze carried an edge that hadn't been there the day before. When the defense attorney tried to derail testimony with procedural nonsense, she cut through it cleanly. When the plaintiff, a single mother evicted after questioning repairs in her unit, stumbled through her words, Janelle gently guided her, gave her time. Her tone was deliberate. Precise. Just enough to make people sit up straighter. After the session ended, one of the junior attorneys from the defense team, a young white man named Rick, lingered behind. He approached her cautiously in the hallway. "Judge Whittaker, if I may. I just wanted to say I saw what happened this morning. I mean, in the lot. And I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened." She looked at him, and for the first time that day, her expression softened slightly, not because his words healed anything, but because she could see the discomfort he was trying to navigate. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But your apology won't change anything unless you use that discomfort to challenge what made it possible in the first place." He nodded, cheeks burning, and stepped away, his silence filled with a truth too large to hold. Meanwhile, Officer Kearns was unraveling in his own way. What he expected to be a routine enforcement action had turned into something much larger. Word had spread quickly. By noon, his supervisor had called him into a side office, voice low but firm, asking for a full written report. Kearns, irritated, had written it with a defensive tone, couching every action behind procedure and security protocol. He didn't feel like he had done anything wrong. Not really. Maybe she was the judge, but how was he supposed to know? She wasn't wearing her robe. She wasn't in a marked vehicle. She hadn't flashed her ID right away. There were ways this could have gone differently. When his union representative called later that day, he answered with tension in his voice, already bracing for the fallout. "I'm telling you, I followed protocol," he insisted. "Nobody said anything about her being the judge until after I'd asked for ID. It's not like I dragged her out of the car or anything." But even as he said the words, a small flicker of doubt crept into his mind. Not guilt. Not accountability. Just the first crack in the wall he'd built around his certainty. Because something about the way everyone looked at him now felt different. The usual nods of agreement had turned into long stares. Conversation stopped when he walked past. And when he returned to his post the next day, another officer had been reassigned to the parking lot. Back upstairs, Janelle was in her office with Marcia and two of her law clerks, preparing for a seminar she was due to lead next month at a law school in D.C. The topic? Implicit bias in the judiciary. Ironic, she thought, how theory and experience so often collided. Marcia, flipping through her notes, paused and looked up. Are you going to report him? Janelle's pen stopped mid-sentence. She looked at Marcia, then out the window at the courtyard below where officers and visitors crossed paths in carefully drawn lines. I don't know yet, she said after a long pause. I want to. But I want it to mean something. Not just for me, but for the others he's probably done this to. One of the clerks, Jamal, added, I've seen him stop delivery drivers before. And once a public defender, too. He plays it cool, but it's always the same type of person. The weight of those observations sat in the room like fog. Unspoken stories. Unwritten complaints. She could feel the pressure building, not just from her own experience, but from the silent expectations of everyone watching. If she didn't speak up, who would? That night, she sat in her apartment with a cup of tea gone cold, the city lights painting fractured reflections across her windows. She replayed the moment over and over, not to relive the pain, but to understand it. Not just what happened, but what it revealed. What it made possible. What it demanded. The next morning, she arrived earlier than usual. She didn't take the private lot. She parked on the street and walked through the front entrance with dozens of others, her head held high, her steps measured. She passed through the metal detector, nodded to the officers, and made her way up without incident. But the whispers followed. The shift in energy. The awareness. In her chambers, a sealed envelope was waiting on her desk, internal memo from the Office of Judicial Conduct. It was standard protocol now, a report had been filed, an investigation opened. It wasn't from her. Someone else had done it. Likely Marcia. Or Jamal. Maybe one of the witnesses. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the wheels were turning. Later that afternoon, she crossed paths with Kearns in the hallway outside courtroom 3D. His posture had changed. Shoulders tense, eyes not quite meeting hers. He offered a stiff nod, the kind meant to be respectful but fell short of sincere. She met his gaze without flinching. Good afternoon, Officer Kearns, she said, her tone steady but unmistakably layered. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again. The words weren't ready. And she wasn't waiting for them. She walked past. There were hearings to oversee. Rulings to write. Justice to deliver. And beneath it all, a slow, rising current building towards something inevitable. Because what Kearns didn't know, what the building didn't know, was that the courtroom wasn't the only place where decisions would be made. And the decision she had quietly reached, would soon turn this courthouse upside down. The courtroom was packed. The air felt different. Thicker. Even the silence had weight. The rustle of papers, the shifting of chairs, the occasional cough, all of it seemed hushed by something heavier than protocol. Something deeper. Reporters lined the back, their notebooks still closed, waiting. Court staff moved carefully, aware of the tension, yet unsure of its exact source. People had heard whispers, but no one really knew what was about to unfold. They just knew this wasn't going to be another typical court proceeding. It couldn't be. Not after everything. Judge Janelle Whitaker sat at the bench, robe on, gavel resting silently beside her. Her face didn't show it, but inside, something was coiled tight. Not rage, not nerves, focus. Everything she'd prepared for had led to this moment, and now the pieces were aligned. She glanced at the attorneys before her, then at the defendant seated at the witness table, a man facing multiple counts of racially discriminatory housing practices. But that wasn't what made the room tremble. What did it, what made the oxygen feel scarce, was who had been subpoenaed to testify today. David Kearns. The room hadn't processed the weight of his name until it was spoken aloud. When the prosecutor stood and calmly requested the presence of Officer David Kearns as a material witness to the pattern of racial profiling contributing to the systemic discrimination under investigation, jaws tightened. Someone in the gallery whispered too loudly. A woman gasped. And in the back of the room, Officer Kearns stood slowly, as if pulled upward by something he couldn't control. He walked forward stiffly, dressed in a pressed uniform that now felt heavier than armor. Every step echoed. He avoided her eyes. He didn't need to meet them to feel her watching. The oath was given, the witness chair creaked as he sat, and the prosecutor wasted no time. Officer Kearns, would you agree that you are tasked with providing equal treatment to all individuals entering this courthouse, regardless of their race or appearance? Kearns nodded, eyes forward. Yes, that's the protocol. And would you say you have always followed that protocol? I follow the rules. I treat everyone according to procedure. The prosecutor didn't respond immediately. He walked to the table, picked up a folder, and opened it slowly before revealing a photo taken just days before. A still from the security footage. It showed Kearns standing rigid in front of Janelle's vehicle, one hand at his side, the other pointing. Her face calm, his expression hard. There was no aggression. No resistance. Just an image that said too much in its silence. Do you recognize this moment? Kearns shifted. Yes. Would you care to explain what was happening here? I was securing the lot. I asked the woman for her ID because she was in a restricted space. That woman was Judge Whitaker, the sitting federal judge of this court. Were you aware of that? I wasn't at the time. She didn't identify herself right away. And how often do you ask judges to identify themselves when pulling into that lot? I don't discriminate. If someone's not in uniform or doesn't show ID, I ask. That's my job. The prosecutor let the silence hang. Then he nodded and walked back to his table, letting the statement settle, letting the courtroom soak in its coldness. Your Honor, he said, turning to Janelle, with your permission, I'd like to admit into evidence the testimony of 3 additional witnesses, all courthouse staff who've filed statements describing similar encounters with Officer Kearns, none of whom were white. The audience stirred. Kearns straightened in his chair, fists tightening slightly. I object, the defense attorney barked suddenly. This is turning into a personal attack. My client isn't responsible for courthouse security, this line of questioning is irrelevant. Janelle's eyes stayed on Kearns, even as she addressed the objection. Overruled. The systemic nature of discriminatory behavior is directly relevant to this case. Continue. The prosecutor nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. As testimony resumed, Kearns sat frozen. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her. Not like this. Not with the power of the bench behind her in a room full of people finally willing to say the things they'd kept to themselves for years. When the session broke for recess, murmurs filled the halls. Reporters gathered in clusters outside the courtroom. But inside, Janelle remained seated. Kearns stood, hesitating, before stepping closer. He cleared his throat. Your Honor. Judge Whitaker, she looked up at him, and for the first time since that day in the parking lot, their eyes met. I want to say I'm sorry, he began, his voice low, hesitant. I didn't mean to disrespect you. Janelle leaned back slightly, watching him with the precision of someone who's heard too many apologies made out of fear, not understanding. You didn't disrespect me, Officer Kearns. You disrespected the position I hold. The people I represent. The ones who come through these doors every day hoping for fairness in a system that sees them the way you saw me, like they don't belong. Kearns's face flushed. It wasn't personal. She tilted her head slightly. That's the problem. It never is. He swallowed hard. I didn't know. And what would have changed if you did? She asked, not cruelly, but with quiet devastation. Would you have been more polite? More cautious? That's not justice, officer. That's hierarchy. And I don't need your caution, I need your accountability. He didn't have an answer. His lips parted, but nothing came out. And in that silence, she stood. There's more to come, she said simply, brushing past him. Later that week, the final hearing in the housing discrimination case took place. The evidence against the landlord was clear. The discriminatory patterns undeniable. The connection between systemic failures and frontline behavior had been drawn with painful precision. But before delivering the ruling, Janelle requested a closed-door meeting with court administration and representatives from internal affairs. In that room, behind glass walls and neutral tones, she laid out her decision, not just for the case, but for the system itself. I'm not seeking punishment for ego. I'm seeking reform, she said. Officer Kearns should not be fired today. That would be too easy. He should face what he's denied. Education. Oversight. Transformation. And the public should see it. The silence in the room spoke volumes. One of the admin staff, a middle-aged black woman with graying hair, exhaled slowly and nodded. Let them watch him grow, she said softly. Or fail trying. And just like that, the plan was set. Not revenge. Not rage. But something deeper. Justice, not only served, but seen. The announcement came just 2 days later. It hit the courthouse like a slow-building wave, reaching every corner, every office, every voice lowered behind closed doors. Officer David Kearns would not be dismissed from his post. Instead, he would be placed under a formal supervision program, an unprecedented internal initiative designed to monitor, evaluate, and retrain courthouse officers found engaging in discriminatory behavior. But more than that, the program would be made public. Transparent. Observed. Tracked. A statement would be released to the press. And Officer Kearns would not be allowed to hide behind silence or policy. When the news broke, the reactions were mixed. Some called it mercy. Others called it brilliance. But everyone understood one thing: this wasn't a punishment. It was a confrontation. The kind Kearns had never faced. One he couldn't talk his way out of. One where the court of public opinion would be watching every move he made, every word he said, every decision he took in uniform. There would be mandatory sessions with anti-bias educators, supervised interactions on courthouse grounds, and a requirement to meet face-to-face with a selected panel of community members whose experiences mirrored the ones he had dismissed for years. Inside the staff conference room on the 4th floor, where the internal briefing was held, Janelle stood before the courthouse personnel, not as a judge presiding from the bench, but as a colleague, a woman, a leader whose voice refused to be drowned. Her tone wasn't vengeful, but precise, unwavering, and deeply personal. She didn't need to raise it to make the room feel the weight of every word. This isn't about humiliation, she said, her eyes fixed on the faces before her, many of whom avoided her gaze. This is about making a system that has long operated on silence confront itself. Officer Kearns's behavior was not unique. What happened in that parking lot wasn't a glitch. It was a mirror. And we all saw it. She paused, letting the discomfort build. Some shifted in their seats. One or two scribbled notes just to avoid the stillness. I want this to mean something, she continued, softer now, but no less powerful. Because I'm tired of watching good people walk through these doors already expecting to be questioned. To be doubted. To be reduced. I don't want apologies. I want change. Later that day, Kearns sat in the small office assigned for his first debrief. Across from him sat Dr. Reuben Hall, a black psychologist contracted to lead the training and evaluation sessions. Reuben was in his late 50s, tall, calm-eyed, and wore a gray sweater that looked like it belonged more in a college lecture than a government building. He didn't start with a lecture. He started with a question. What was it about her that made you stop her? Kearns leaned back, defensive already. She didn't identify herself. Reuben gave him time, waited out the instinctual response. Plenty of people don't. Judges come in without robes, without ID. You ever stop any of the white ones? Kearns hesitated. That's not fair. They're recognizable. I know them. I've worked here for years. Reuben nodded slowly. So your familiarity decides who gets questioned? Not protocol. Kearns stiffened. No. That's not what I meant. Look, I've made mistakes, okay? I didn't know who she was. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. Reuben leaned forward, folding his hands. David, racism isn't always about what you try to do. It's about what your habits create. If your habits put suspicion on certain faces, certain tones of voice, certain clothes, then the impact is still racism. Even if the intention wasn't hate. That's what you need to understand. Kearns looked away, jaw clenched. He didn't answer. Meanwhile, Janelle received an email from a community liaison who had heard about the new oversight program. They wanted to invite her to speak at a citywide justice summit, a space where police, legal professionals, and the public would engage in real conversation about systemic bias. She agreed, not out of ambition, but because the conversation had to keep going. Accountability didn't end with a policy. It began with presence. A week later, the summit filled a university auditorium with energy, tension, and unspoken truths. Janelle took the stage, not in her robe, but in a dark suit, minimal jewelry, and the calm, steady voice that had become her armor. When she told the story, not just of the incident, but of what it revealed, she didn't name Kearns. She didn't have to. Everyone already knew. What she focused on instead was the everyday impact of being doubted, dismissed, made to prove yourself in places you've already earned. You don't forget the feeling of having your legitimacy questioned, she said. You carry it. In your posture, your breath, your silence. And the problem isn't just the question, it's how many times you've had to answer it. The room was still. Even the officers in the audience didn't move. Afterward, in the hallway just outside the auditorium, Kearns approached her quietly. He had been invited by the organizers, encouraged to observe. He wasn't in uniform. Just a plain shirt and slacks that made him look smaller somehow. I watched your talk, he said, standing awkwardly, hands in his pockets. I didn't think I'd stay through the whole thing, but I did. She didn't answer, letting him sit in the discomfort of his own words. I've been doing the sessions, he added, voice low. The meetings. The training. All of it. Good, she said, evenly. How does it feel? He swallowed. Like I'm being dismantled. And rebuilt. She nodded. That's the point. Kearns looked at her, and for the first time, his expression wasn't defensive. It was, exposed. I didn't know how much I didn't know. Until I had to see myself through other people's eyes. Through yours. Her eyes held his. And what did you see? He exhaled. Someone I wouldn't have trusted. And that's the part that scares me the most. There was a long silence between them. Not angry. Not resolved. Just real. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said quietly. But I needed you to know I hear it now. All of it. Janelle's voice didn't rise. She didn't offer comfort or condemnation. Then do something with it. That's how you make it matter. As he turned to leave, she added softly, Officer Kearns, we're not asking for perfection. Just reflection. That's where change begins. He paused, gave a small nod, and walked away. By the end of that month, the courthouse felt different. The oversight program expanded. Other officers were enrolled. Trainings were normalized. Complaints were investigated with new urgency. Not everyone liked it. Some resisted. But the shift had begun. And every morning, when Judge Janelle Whitaker walked into that building, she was no longer just seen. She was recognized. Not because of her title. But because she had forced the building itself to look in the mirror. The retribution had never been about revenge. It had always been about recognition. The days that followed were filled with tension, not explosive, but steady, slow, like a quiet tightening of strings no one could quite name. The courthouse didn't speak about what happened out loud, but it knew. You could feel it in the way people walked a little slower through the security checkpoint, the way conversations paused whenever Judge Whitaker entered a room, and in the way Officer David Kearns now moved through the halls, not as the man he had been before, but as someone reshaped by his own unraveling. His presence no longer carried that effortless authority it once had. Now, it bore the weight of someone learning how to exist differently. Not out of punishment, but out of consequence. And while the public-facing world called what had happened a lesson, inside those walls, it was something more, an ongoing reckoning with what justice actually looks like when it lands in real time, between real people. Behind the scenes, Janelle had become the center of countless debates she hadn't asked to be part of. Letters arrived at her office, some praising her grace, others questioning her methods. A few were venomous, filled with entitlement masked as concern. Why wasn't the officer fired? Didn't she want real justice? Was this enough? Was this too much? She read every word in silence, sometimes pausing mid-sentence, not because of shock, but because of how predictable the questions had become. People wanted a clean ending. But she knew better. Real justice rarely gave that. It lived in the middle, uncomfortable, slow, and full of questions that had no perfect answers. One afternoon, she sat across from Marcia in her chambers. Sunlight spilled through the blinds, catching the dust in lazy spirals. Marcia held a memo in her hands from the Internal Oversight Board, detailing the next steps in the reform program that had grown out of Kearns's case. Her eyes scanned the document, but her voice was uncertain. "Do you think this is actually going to change anything?" she asked, not cynically, but with the exhaustion of someone who had seen too many promises evaporate after the press conference ended. Janelle didn't answer right away. She leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, the corners of her mouth drawn tight. "Change doesn't always look like revolution," she said. "Sometimes it looks like resistance." A pause. A person who would have stayed silent finally speaking. "But is that enough?" Marcia's voice cracked slightly. "We watched him try to erase you with a look. And now he gets a second chance." Janelle turned to her, her gaze soft but firm. "He doesn't get a second chance. He gets a choice. And so do we. To decide if we believe people can be more than their worst moment. Or if we just want revenge dressed up like justice." That silence between them was the heart of the dilemma. The question that pulsed beneath every headline, every closed-door meeting. Is accountability only real if it ends in destruction? Or can transformation count as justice, too? Out in the city, the story hadn't faded. Community forums began referencing the Judge Whitaker incident as a symbol, not just of strength, but of strategy. Universities invited her to speak. Young law students sent letters thanking her for her restraint, her power, her refusal to disappear behind the desk when she could have chosen silence. But with that praise came pressure. People now expected her to lead not just the courtroom, but a movement. And that weight, of being more than one woman, was starting to press against her skin. Then came the request from the mayor's office. A citywide task force on systemic bias, with Janelle at the helm. It was an honor. It was a trap. It was both. Accepting it would mean stepping deeper into public life, into scrutiny, into a role that wasn't hers to carry alone. But declining would send another kind of message, one she wasn't sure she wanted to deliver. And so the question circled her like a shadow: where does justice end and responsibility begin? Meanwhile, Kearns's journey through the public accountability program had become a case study in discomfort. The sessions forced him to listen, not argue. To hear stories from people he'd never considered before. Former defendants. Legal staff. A teenage boy who'd been stopped by a courthouse officer 3 times in the same month just for wearing a hoodie and looking out of place. These sessions weren't about finger-pointing, they were about truth. Ugly, quiet, insistent truth. And somewhere inside him, the cracks widened. He began asking questions instead of giving excuses. He started sitting longer in the uncomfortable moments. Once, after a particularly raw session, he approached the facilitator during a break. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. "I don't even know where to start." The facilitator looked at him, tired but patient. "You're not here to fix it. You're here to stop pretending it isn't real." Those words stuck with him. More than he wanted them to. Because deep down, he knew that was what he'd been doing for years, pretending the weight he carried was earned, not inherited. Pretending that being a good cop meant being a silent one. Pretending that intention was the only thing that mattered. But now, every step through the courthouse felt like a new version of walking, less confident, but more aware. The final stretch of his training included community restitution. Not a punishment, but an opportunity. He would have to sit in community listening circles, not as a speaker, but as a witness. No uniform. No badge. Just his presence and his ears. And during one of those sessions, an elderly man leaned forward, eyes burning with memory. "You ever look at someone and assume they don't belong?" he asked, not directing it at Kearns, but through him. "That's a power you don't even see until it's taken away. That's what you had. And that's what you used. Whether you meant to or not." Kearns didn't respond. But he didn't look away either. Back at the courthouse, the ripple effects had begun to harden into change. Security protocols were rewritten. Officers underwent deeper, more intentional training. There was pushback. There were complaints. But the system was shifting, not because it wanted to, but because it had been forced to see itself. Janelle kept her distance from Kearns throughout this process, not out of spite, but out of clarity. She wasn't his mentor. She wasn't his savior. She had made a decision rooted in strategy, not sentiment. But one afternoon, as she prepared to leave early for a university lecture, she passed him in the hallway. He paused, nodded slightly. She nodded back. No words exchanged. Just recognition. Not of equals. But of presence. Later that night, at the university, she stood before a crowd of students hungry for a blueprint. They wanted certainty. They wanted right and wrong. But Janelle gave them something harder. "There's no clean path," she said. "Sometimes justice looks like someone losing power. Sometimes it looks like someone learning how to hold it differently. And sometimes it looks like choosing to lead when staying silent would have been easier." A student raised his hand, voice shaking slightly. "How do you know if it's enough?" She paused, thinking carefully. "You don't," she answered. "You just do the next right thing. And then the next. And then the next." The room fell silent, not out of confusion, but respect. They had expected certainty. She had given them responsibility. Back in Baltimore, the courthouse began to settle into its new rhythm. The questions didn't vanish. The tensions didn't disappear. But people had started asking why certain things were done the way they were. That alone was a revolution. And beneath it all, something larger was unfolding. A decision that would change everything. Because what Janelle hadn't told anyone, not Marcia, not the mayor, not even the oversight board, was that she wasn't sure she wanted to stay on the bench. Not because she was tired of the work. But because she had started dreaming of something bigger. Something that would force the system to confront itself not just in a courtroom, but across an entire city. And the day she finally made her choice would leave everyone speechless. The decision had been growing inside Janelle like a quiet echo, repeating itself in moments when no one else was around to hear. It wasn't loud, it wasn't urgent, but it was persistent. Every step she took inside the courthouse now felt heavier, not because she regretted what had happened, but because she understood the magnitude of what had begun. The movement she had ignited wasn't hers to carry alone, and more, she found herself thinking about impact, not in terms of rulings or written opinions, but in reach, in transformation, in the kind of work that didn't come with robes or gavels. She'd spent years mastering the law, applying it with precision, holding the system accountable from within. But now, she found herself wondering whether justice, real justice, needed to live somewhere else entirely. Late one evening, she remained in her chambers long after the staff had gone home. The city lights flickered through the blinds, and the sound of a janitor's cart echoed faintly from the hallway. She sat at her desk, surrounded by silence and half-read memos, staring at a single envelope she hadn't yet opened. It was from the mayor's office. An official offer. Lead the task force. Shape city policy. Build a platform for systemic change outside the courtroom. Her name, in bold letters. Her choice, folded neatly inside. She didn't open it. Not yet. A soft knock broke the stillness. It was Marcia. Still in her coat, keys in hand, looking hesitant. Janelle raised an eyebrow, surprised. I saw your light, Marcia said, stepping inside slowly. Figured you were still here. Janelle gestured toward the chair across from her. Join me, unless you have somewhere better to be. Marcia sat down, setting her keys on the edge of the desk. Her eyes shifted toward the envelope. That from the mayor? She asked gently. Janelle nodded. You gonna take it? Janelle looked at her, then exhaled. I don't know. Marcia frowned. Why not? You could do more from that position than half this city council combined. I know, Janelle said quietly. But I also know what it costs. Marcia leaned forward, her voice soft but steady. You already paid the cost. Every day you walk into this building and remind people what they tried not to see. You paid it in full. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, it was full of shared knowing, of years and moments that didn't need to be explained. Janelle finally said, if I leave the bench, I'm giving something up. The robe still matters. The courtroom still matters. Marcia didn't look away. Yeah, but if you stay, what are you giving up instead? It was a question Janelle had been asking herself in pieces for weeks, but hearing it aloud settled something. She looked down at the envelope again. This time, her hand reached for it. Meanwhile, across town, David Kearns sat alone in the dim corner of a church basement where his final listening circle was being held. He wasn't required to speak, only to listen, but something had changed in him since the process began. For the first time, he wanted to say something, not to defend himself, not to correct the record, but to face it. To name what he had never dared to look at before. He waited until the session was nearly over. People were already standing, collecting their things, before he cleared his throat. I know this doesn't make up for anything, he began, his voice uneven, eyes focused on the floor. But I need to say something. Not for credit. For clarity. The room paused. No one interrupted. No one offered comfort. He continued. I used to think racism was something loud. Something hateful. I thought I wasn't part of it because I didn't use slurs or get violent. But this program, these conversations, they made me realize something. Silence is violence. Assumptions are violence. That moment in the parking lot, it wasn't a mistake. It was the result of 100 beliefs I never challenged. And I did that. I made her feel small. I made her prove herself to me, when I was the one who should have been proving I was worthy of the badge. The facilitator watched him quietly, arms crossed. Kearns looked up finally. I don't expect forgiveness. But I do want responsibility. If there's more I can do, if there's a way I can help other officers see what I couldn't, I want to try. Not because I'm reformed, but because I'm still learning. The group dispersed slowly after that, some offering him a nod, others walking past without acknowledgement. And that, too, was justice. The right to be uncomfortable. The absence of applause. Back at the courthouse, word began to spread that Janelle was considering stepping down. It wasn't public yet, but courthouse gossip moved faster than press releases. Some judges expressed confusion. Others disapproval. But there were those who understood. The clerk from courtroom 2A left a note on her desk one morning that simply read, "Whatever path you choose, it will matter. Thank you for showing us how to walk it." The next day, Janelle met with the Oversight Board in a closed-door meeting to finalize the expansion of the Officer Accountability Program. As she walked into the room, the chair of the board stood and offered his hand. "You've changed the culture in this courthouse," he said, eyes firm. "Whether you stay or not, your footprint's already here." She shook his hand but said nothing. There was nothing left to prove. Later that afternoon, Kearns requested a brief meeting with her, not as part of the program, but as an individual. It was granted. He entered her chambers looking smaller than she remembered him. Not physically, but in posture. In presence. Not diminished, just stripped of that invisible armor he used to wear. "I won't take up much of your time," he said. "But I wanted to thank you. Not for your patience. Not even for the second chance. But for showing me what accountability can actually look like." Janelle regarded him carefully. "Are you ready to carry it?" He nodded. "Yes. And I know it's not a one-time thing. It's a lifetime thing." For the first time, she let a trace of warmth show. Not approval. Not absolution. Just acknowledgement. A human one. "I hope you mean that," she said. "Because eyes are on you now. And they should be." He nodded again, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "If you do take that position, if you leave the bench, this place will miss something." She smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe it's time to build something new." That night, Janelle sat at her kitchen table, the envelope finally opened, the offer read and reread. A contract. A statement of purpose. A roadmap for change. She placed it beside a framed photo of her parents, her mother in scrubs, her father in his transit uniform, both of them young, proud, weary, strong. The ones who had taught her that presence was resistance. That dignity was power. She closed her eyes and allowed the decision to become real in her chest. She would not walk away from justice. She would carry it forward. The morning she submitted her resignation, the sky outside was washed in a pale, diffused light, the kind of sky that made everything feel suspended, waiting. Janelle arrived earlier than usual, before the halls had filled with the familiar rhythms of clicking heels and courthouse murmurs. She carried the letter in her bag like a quiet weight, not heavy with regret, but with certainty. There was no announcement. No speech. She walked past the front security desk, past the room where months ago her identity had been questioned, and into her chambers where the light sliced in long lines through the blinds. She sat at her desk, smoothed the envelope with both hands, and placed it in the center. It wasn't just a resignation. It was a transition. A closing and an opening in the same breath. Marcia arrived minutes later, her eyes still waking up, coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. She paused when she saw Janelle sitting there, unusually still. "You okay?" she asked cautiously. Janelle looked up, her face composed but full of something deeper, release, maybe. She nodded toward the envelope. "I did it," she said softly. "It's done." Marcia blinked. Then her eyes dropped to the envelope. She slowly sat across from her, setting the coffee down without a word. The silence that filled the room wasn't one of shock, but of adjustment. They had both known this moment was coming. Feeling it arrive was something else entirely. "You're sure?" Marcia asked after a pause. "Yes," Janelle said. "It's time." Marcia swallowed, her voice thickening with emotion. "This building, it won't be the same without you." Janelle reached across the desk, placing a hand gently over Marcia's. "Then make sure it remembers why I was here." As the day unfolded, word spread faster than she expected. Judges stopped by quietly, some offering congratulations, others veiling concern behind polite smiles. One, an older white man who had shared her bench for years but rarely her burdens, stood in the doorway of her chambers with his hands folded behind his back. "I read your letter," he said. "It's going to cause a stir." Janelle nodded, expression unreadable. "Then maybe it's the right decision." He nodded too, slowly, then cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, I respected the way you handled everything. You had every right to go after him harder. You didn't." Janelle's eyes met his. It wasn't about him. It never was. And he understood that. Or maybe he didn't. But he left without saying anything else. By noon, her inbox was full. Invitations, interviews, endorsements, questions. People wanted to know what she would do next, how she would lead, whether she would run for office, start a foundation, take over a commission. Everyone wanted to name the next chapter for her. But Janelle, as always, would write it herself. That afternoon, she stepped out of her chambers and walked the halls one last time, not out of sentimentality, but out of intention. She passed the security desk, where a new officer stood, younger, black, alert but respectful. He straightened when he saw her. She stopped for a moment. "You're new," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Officer Taylor." She extended her hand. "Judge Whitaker." He smiled nervously. "I know who you are." Her eyes softened. "Good. Then you know what this job really means." "I do," he said. "And I'll do it right." She held his gaze a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "See that you do." Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves danced across the steps as she descended, heels steady, coat catching the breeze. Marcia followed behind her, holding a small box of personal things. Neither spoke until they reached the car. "You ready?" Marcia asked, the keys jangling in her hand. Janelle looked at the building one last time, not with nostalgia, but with clarity. "I've never been more ready," she said. Meanwhile, in the small community hall where Kearns had continued attending sessions voluntarily, he sat across from a panel of residents invited to participate in a roundtable. They had read the reports, watched the footage, followed the story. He was no longer there by court mandate. He was there by choice. And that mattered. Not to everyone, but to some. One man, tall with silver streaks in his beard, leaned forward, his voice calm but heavy with history. "You understand why some of us still don't believe this? Why some of us still think this whole redemption arc is just for show?" Kearns nodded. "Yes. I do." The man watched him a long moment, then asked, "So why keep showing up?" Kearns exhaled. "Because the day I stop showing up is the day I prove you right. And I can't do that. I need to stay uncomfortable. I need to be reminded. Another woman, seated beside the man, crossed her arms and tilted her head. You think you can fix what you did to her? To all of us, by extension. No, Kern said simply. I can't fix it. But I can change the way I move through the world. I can use what I've learned to challenge others like me. That's all I can do. And they heard him. Not everyone forgave him. Not everyone trusted him. But they heard him. Janelle's first public appearance after her resignation was at a televised town hall event hosted by the city council. The auditorium was filled to capacity, with standing room only. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters clustered in the aisles. The mayor introduced her not with a list of titles, but with a single sentence that quieted the room. Judge Whitaker reminded this city that justice doesn't just sit in a courtroom, it walks in every door, every hallway, every street. She stepped up to the podium, hands resting lightly on the wood. The applause died down quickly, replaced by an expectant silence. I didn't leave the bench because I was tired, she began. I left because I knew my reach needed to grow. The courtroom taught me how to listen. But the streets are where I need to speak. She spoke not about the incident, but about the system. Not about her experience, but about collective truth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply laid out the path forward: policy reform, public education, deep accountability woven into every layer of city leadership. At the end of her speech, a young girl in the front row stood up timidly. Miss Whitaker, she asked, voice trembling, do you ever get scared? Janelle smiled gently. Every day. But fear isn't what stops me. Silence is. So I keep speaking. The room stood in ovation. The following week, her name appeared on a short list of candidates being considered for a statewide leadership role in equity and justice reform. It wasn't something she had applied for. It was something others had begun to demand on her behalf. And still, she moved quietly, intentionally, refusing to be swallowed by the noise of admiration or the distractions of power. One evening, walking home from a meeting, she passed a mural being painted along a downtown wall. It was a series of faces, real people from the community. Activists. Teachers. Survivors. At the far end, still incomplete, was a woman in a black coat, her hand extended, not in defiance, but in offering. Janelle stood there for a long time, watching the artist shade in the contours of her likeness. She didn't speak. She didn't interrupt. The artist looked over, smiled slightly, then returned to his work. Justice didn't end with a verdict. It began when people decided to stay in the work, even when the cameras disappeared. And Janelle Whitaker, no longer behind the bench, no longer bound by walls, was just getting started. 6 months later, the city looked different, not because its streets had changed, but because its people had. The ripples of what had started in a courthouse parking lot had become waves across institutions. A new task force had been launched with a mandate that included community-led evaluations, racial bias audits, and systemic reviews. Janelle Whitaker had become the inaugural chairwoman of the commission, not just in title, but in presence. She moved through council chambers and neighborhood forums with the same quiet force she once brought to the bench, but now she was unbound. Her words carried even more weight because they weren't expected, they were earned. She had stepped out of the court not to leave justice behind, but to carry it into spaces where people had long been denied access to it. She didn't wear a robe anymore, but the respect she commanded came from something deeper: authenticity, transparency, and relentless purpose. On the night of her official swearing-in, hundreds gathered downtown in an open-air community space. Families brought lawn chairs, students lined the walls, and elders sat in the front rows with knowing eyes. When Janelle walked on stage, she didn't stand behind the podium. She stood in front of it. No barrier. No height difference. Just her, facing the people she was about to serve in a new way. She spoke not with triumph, but with clarity. This role isn't about fixing what's broken with a pen, she said, voice steady, it's about rebuilding trust where trust was never allowed to grow. It's about listening longer than we speak. It's about turning our anger into action and our pain into policy. It's about seeing the humanity in each other, even when it's inconvenient. The crowd rose to its feet in applause, not because they were dazzled, but because they were seen. She wasn't a symbol of perfection. She was a reminder that power used responsibly could be revolutionary. Elsewhere in the city, David Kearns had quietly requested reassignment. Not out of shame, but out of understanding. He no longer stood at the courthouse gates. He now worked in the city's new community policing support unit, a branch created to build relationships between law enforcement and neighborhoods that had long distrusted them. He wasn't in charge. He didn't ask to be. But he showed up early, stayed late, and spent more time listening than talking. He partnered with local youth programs, joined community cleanups, and, in one unexpected moment of irony, invited a public defender he once clashed with to lead a workshop on implicit bias for new recruits. At one point, an older officer approached him in the locker room and muttered, "You're really going all in on this woke cop thing, huh?" Kearns didn't flinch. He simply said, "I'm going all in on not being who I used to be." That wasn't a performance. That was a choice. A hard one. One he'd have to make every day. Marcia, now serving as Janelle's chief of staff, had grown into a role few women her age ever reached. She coordinated the commission's outreach initiatives, met weekly with grassroots organizers, and became the connective tissue between communities and the city's leadership. In one of their late-night planning sessions, Janelle turned to her with a rare softness and said, "You were always more than my assistant. Now the city gets to see what I saw every day." Marcia smiled, nodded, and kept working. There was still too much to do. The mural that once showed Janelle's likeness was now complete, her image surrounded by others who had stood against systems too large to name. Beside her, the artist had painted symbols, an open book, a pair of balanced scales, and beneath her feet, roots stretching into the soil, connecting all the faces around her. She visited it on the anniversary of the incident that sparked everything, not to relive the past, but to honor it. A group of students on a field trip passed by, whispering when they saw her. One girl, no older than 10, walked over and said, "You're the judge, right? The one who changed everything." Janelle knelt to meet her eye level and said, "I'm the woman who didn't stay silent. That's all. But you get to decide what comes next." That was the legacy, not the courtroom, not the title, not the headline. The real legacy was in the invitation her story offered to others, to stand when dismissed, to speak when silenced, and to lead not with ego, but with empathy. And now, to you listening, what does this story mean to you? Maybe you've been Janelle, navigating rooms where your worth had to be proven again and again. Maybe you've been Marcia, waiting for someone to give you space to shine. Maybe you've even been Kearns, realizing too late the weight of your own assumptions. Or maybe, just maybe, you're someone who still doesn't know where you stand, but you're ready to start listening, start learning, and start changing. This story wasn't about a dramatic takedown. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice in its realest form, accountability, growth, and the refusal to accept silence as safety. So I ask you, what would you have done? What will you do now? Tell us in the comments, your thoughts, your feelings, your questions. Let's make this a space where stories like Janelle's don't just end, they continue through you. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel seen, or made you see something differently, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful narratives that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after the story ends. We'll see you in the next one.